Welcome to the debate. Today we're focusing on, well, a really monumental challenge in global finance, corporate fraud. Specifically, how the world's two biggest economies, the United States and China, are tackling accountability. And they're operating on fundamentally different structural principles. And the material we've looked at suggests both are seeing, well, serious setbacks and successes. So the central question we really need to grapple with today is this. Does the U.S. system, the one characterized by its decentralized enforcement, mandated transparency, reliance on external watchdogs, does that ultimately provide sort of the superior long-term accountability needed for these complex corporate frauds? Or do China's sweeping new centralized reforms, with their very sharp focus on imposing stringent personal liability on leaders, address systemic risks maybe more quickly, more effectively?
Okay.
I'll be arguing that the U.S. model, anchored by established legal frameworks, a culture of independent scrutiny, ensures more sustainable accountability, even if the wheels sometimes turn a bit slowly.
Right. And I suppose I come at it from a slightly different angle. I agree the U.S. system is mature, obviously. But, well, maturity doesn't always equal efficacy, does it? Especially when you're facing a new generation of what you might call institutional opacity. So I believe China's rapid, centralized structural reforms, the ones that prioritize immediate and pretty severe personal consequences for corporate leadership, they actually offer a far more direct and frankly necessary deterrent against that sort of collective complicity that has historically really defined large-scale corporate deception in that region.
Okay, I see why you think that. Focusing on the speed and the immediate deterrent effect. But let me offer maybe a different perspective on let's say, the endurance of the U.S. model. Yes, our system does produce spectacular, very complicated frauds, often hidden behind, Silicon Valley hype or sophisticated financial instruments. We see this clearly in cases like Theranos or Enron back in the day, or the incredibly complex web of FTX.
Big ones.
Big ones, exactly. But the system, I'd argue, provides a clear, aggressive, and ultimately pretty consistent path to accountability. Federal enforcement agencies like the SEC, the DOJ, they successfully prosecute these cases, and that leads to major convictions, serious sentences. The accountability is importantly public, it's transparent, and it's confirmed by an independent judiciary. Think of Elizabeth Holmes, Sam Bankman-Fried, both convicted and sentenced just in recent years. And furthermore, our accountability isn't solely dependent on the government. It's fiercely supported by a culture of independent investigative journalism. The Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, acting as really crucial external watchdogs. That's a role that, well, the Chinese media simply cannot perform due to the centralized controls there.
Okay, that's a compelling argument if you focus on those high-profile individual convictions, the sort of celebrity criminals, the ones selling the hype, as you said. But I think that view, it kind of misunderstands the fundamental challenge China is actually facing. The problem there isn't really individual ego amplified by venture capital. It's more systemic opacity, that institutional lack of transparency that allows massive internal corporate deception to just flourish. Frauds like Luckin Coffee, which fabricated hundreds of millions in sales, or Kangmei Pharmaceutical, which overstated billions, literally billions in cash reserves. These require widespread institutional complicity.
Right.
And I'm sorry, but I just don't quite buy the effectiveness of the U.S. decentralized model, which, as you say, is built on trust and disclosure, when it's confronted with that kind of deep institutional rot. And that is why China's structural response, using centralized power to essentially mandate a culture shift, is potentially so potent. The revised corporate law, the one effective July 1, 2024, it fundamentally changes the game by heightening personal accountability on a scale we really haven't seen before.
Heightening liability is, of course, important. But how does this new law translate practically? I mean, we have strict rules in the U.S. too, like SOX.
Oh, but this is key. The new law codifies really expansive duties of loyalty and care. Specifically, you look at Articles 180 and 188, making directors and board members personally liable for company losses. losses resulting from actions like, say, failing to collect overdue shareholder contributions or illegally reducing capital. We're talking about personal financial exposure that goes far beyond just a corporate fine that the company pays. This centralized legislative force aims squarely at breaking that historical culture where, directors could kind of hide behind collective decisions and plausible deniability or institutional ignorance.
Okay, let's test the efficacy of these frameworks then. Yours built on centralized deterrence, mine on decentralized exposure. Let's use a perfect real-world cross-border challenge. The infamous cases of the Chinese reverse mergers, the CRMs that went public in the U.S. in the 2000s and 2010s.
Right. And, well, this is frankly a devastating example for the U.S. system's oversight, isn't it? I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the so-called bonding effect of listing in the U.S., the idea that listing itself enforces accountability through reputation and regulation. I don't think it worked at all in this case. Research into these CRMs showed quite clearly that the discrepancies between their U.S. financial filings and the filings they made back home with Chinese government agencies were profoundly abnormal, meaning they were deliberately cooked.
Profoundly abnormal might be an understatement, yeah.
It really is. Analysis showed that the abnormal difference for net income, so the difference not explained by standard U.S.-China GAAP accounting rules, was an astonishing 620 times the normal difference. 620 times! I mean, that is direct statistical evidence of massive, deliberate accounting fraud designed solely to entice U.S. investors. So if the U.S. transparency framework was so superior, how did hundreds of these fraudulent companies list and, frankly, fleece investors for years before the whole scheme imploded?
Okay, I absolutely acknowledge that the failure of initial oversight there was immense. And that statistic, the 620x difference, that's wild. It perfectly illustrates the scale of the malfeasance we're talking about. But hold on, doesn't that mass exposure ultimately prove the long-term strength of the U.S. system? We identified the fraud eventually, even if the initial listing mechanism failed.
Identified it late, though.
Identified it late, perhaps, but the crucial point here is that the U.S. system was deliberately hindered. U.S. regulators were essentially fighting with one hand tied behind their back because, as you know, Chinese rules prohibit domestic auditors from sending essential audit materials outside China. This significantly limited the PCAOB, our accounting police, basically from properly policing the auditors of these specific companies. So yes, the U.S. system exposed the fraud, even if jurisdictional complexity hampered and delayed the final prosecution.
Exposure is necessary, I grant you, but deterrence really requires timely punishment. The exposure often came far too late for investors who had already lost everything. And yes, prosecution may have been hampered by cross-border rules, but let's look at the response. The SEC filed fraud cases against, over 40 issuers and executives among the CRMs, and securities class action lawsuits were filed against maybe 1 in 4 CRMs. That is a massive legal effort, yes, but it took years. Years.
And that judicial response, that aggressive pursuit by the SEC, the wave of class action suits, that is precisely what reinforces long-term accountability and market trust. It ensures that victims have a path, albeit sometimes a slow one, to redress.
But speed matters deeply when you're facing institutional fraud driven by short-term pressures. And this brings us right back to personal liability. China's new approach targeting individual culpability seems a far more direct answer to the cultural pressure that breeds this kind of collective complicity. Look, when you have a massive institutional fraud, hitting the CEO with a fine is often just, it's seen as a cost of doing business, paid by the shareholders anyway.
Mm-hmm.
The new Chinese corporate law imposes personal, financial, and criminal penalties, yes, but crucially, misconduct can lead to immediate, severe repercussions for directors already in China who are facing investigation. I'm talking about things like travel restrictions, visa denials, entry bans, and the really notorious exit bans. This creates an immediate, potentially crushing personal deterrent that sort of bypasses the complexities of cross-border data sharing or slow judicial proceedings. It forces compliance based on, fear of immediate personal consequences.
I respect that focus on immediate deterrence. I do. But I think that view maybe misunderstands the fundamental risk of concentrating so much power and relying on compliance driven primarily by fear. I mean, is compliance based on the threat of an exit ban truly preferable or more sustainable in the long run than compliance based on institutional trust and the rule of law? Look at the U.S. culture, the move fast and break things mentality. It definitely encourages founders to oversell, blurring the line between optimism and outright deception. Theranos is the poster child for that. But accountability is delivered, eventually, through a sophisticated, transparent judicial process, where the defendant is forced to defend their actions publicly. China's centralized power, while allowing for rapid, severe sanctions, it risks inconsistency, doesn't it? And potentially selective enforcement, especially without a truly independent judiciary or a free press to challenge the state's narrative.
Okay, we can agree that consistency is crucial, but historical consistency in China arguably meant consistently inadequate enforcement against massive fraud. The severity of the new sanctions seems proportionate to the scale of deception they're trying to excise. We're talking about a structural problem here. When the system lacks inherent institutional checks and balances, a rapid, centralized force imposing severe personal deterrence is arguably the fastest way to mandate a significant cultural shift away from that ingrained opacity.
But if compliance is based purely on fear, what happens when that central eye, that scrutiny, is directed elsewhere? The moment that pressure eases, doesn't the fraud risk just return? Because the underlying institutional morality, if you will, hasn't necessarily been fixed by due process and public reckoning.
That's an interesting point regarding institutional trust. But have you considered how China might be actively trying to build those safeguards now, using that centralized power precisely for rapid institutional development? My perspective is that the centralized model actually allows for the rapid development of robust enforcement mechanisms that perhaps took the U.S. decades to fully implement.
How so?
Well, for example, the sheer volume of regulatory action is undeniable. The CSRC, their securities regulator, investigated almost 400 illegal disclosure and fraud cases just between 2021 and 2023. That demonstrates a massive, sustained regulatory crackdown, not just sporadic enforcement.
Okay, those crackdowns are certainly impressive in scale, but the question remains, are they consistent in application, or are they sometimes, politically motivated demonstrations of force?
I think they're part of a broader, targeted structural reform effort. And perhaps more critically, China is establishing powerful new whistleblower protection mechanisms through the 2021 measures. These aren't just sort of polite suggestions. They offer significant monetary awards, up to 1 million RMB, which is substantial, to whistleblowers who report major violations. And crucially, they mandate serious sanctions against employers who retaliate, including compensation of double the statutory severance pay. This directly incentivizes internal compliance and external reporting, rapidly building the kind of transparency infrastructure that was historically missing.
I do acknowledge that introducing monetary incentives and strong anti-retaliation measures is a powerful move toward developing internal transparency. That's significant. However, the U.S. system's real strength, I'd argue, remains its consistency and the deep legal foundation provided by Sarbanes-Oxley, which has been embedded for over 20 years now. Take Section 302 of SOX. It mandates that senior executives must personally certify the accuracy of their financial reports. This isn't abstract. It forces personal ownership of the financials and ensures legal liability before a fraud even potentially occurs. This standard, along with the Section 404 requirements for internal control reports, reinforces accountability and maintains a known standard that foreign subsidiaries generally must adhere to, regardless of where they operate.
But does the SOX framework, mature as it is, does it really stop the new kinds of complex, sophisticated frauds we're seeing now? I mean, FTX wasn't really undone by a Section 302 violation initially. It was undone by external media exposure and then subsequent prosecution for, outright deception and commingling of funds. The question isn't just whether SOX exists, but whether its compliance framework provides a sufficient deterrent against extreme ambition and, modern financial engineering.
SOX provides the bedrock foundation, I'd say, and the independent courts and media provide the indispensable safety net on top of that. Fraud might still occur, yes, but it is exposed and punished, usually, through a reliable, consistent judicial process. And that consistency is absolutely crucial for maintaining public trust in open markets globally.
Consistency under the U.S. system, though, can mean that the wheels of justice turn slowly, sometimes far too slowly to prevent systemic collapse or protect small investors before the damage is done. And the sheer scale of historical institutional fraud in China suggests that their older, less strict system was, perhaps, consistently inadequate. So the new structural focus on director liability, combined with rapid regulatory mobilization, seems designed specifically to excise that institutional opacity at the root by making the risk of misconduct immediate and personally ruinous for the actual decision-makers.
So, to summarize my position, ultimately, the U.S. system, grounded in transparency, independent judicial review, and that established regulatory framework of SOX, ensures that even highly sophisticated frauds are eventually uncovered and penalized. This public, transparent process reinforces long-term accountability and, importantly, trust in the system itself.
And I would maintain that China's new focus on stringent personal liability for directors, coupled with centralized, rapid regulatory action, directly confronts the unique institutional pressures and the sort of collective corporate misconduct endemic to that structure. It creates potentially a faster, more effective deterrent mechanism against systemic structural risk than perhaps reliance on lengthy judicial processes allows.
The material we discussed clearly suggests that both nations are grappling with profound challenges presented by, well, ambition, technology, and corporate secrecy. The U.S. maybe excels at uncovering and prosecuting complex, often individualized frauds through its mature legal processes.
While China is very rapidly building safeguards designed to target structural institutional risk by leveraging centralized legislative power, it really leaves the listener, I think, to consider which approach, accountability through consistent process and transparency, or deterrence through immediate, severe personal sanction, might best mitigate the inherent and often transnational risks of our current global economy.